Thanks, Sarah. Got it. So my name is Nikki Roach. I am the Policy and Communications Coordinator at the San Francisco Bay Joint Venture. Thank you all for coming to this funding forum today. It's great to see such interest in this topic. Many of you may be aware that there are upwards of billions of dollars right now coming in through the federal government through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act into natural resources agencies. So we have three here, well, four to talk to you today. We have the EPA, Luisa Valiela. We have NOAA with Becky Smythe and Natalie Costantino Manning. And then we have Jessica Davenport representing State Coastal Conservancy and SFBRA. Myself and Sarah Haugen will be kind of facilitating this discussion. Sarah's also from SFBRA, State Coastal Conservancy. And I'm going to go ahead and let the panelists briefly introduce themselves and their roles at their organizations. So Louisa, we'll start with you.
Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all. I'm Luisa Valiela, EPA Region 9. I'm the lead for the San Francisco Bay program, which includes a competitive grant program, the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund, that I will share slides on momentarily.
Thanks, Luisa. Jessica?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Davenport. I'm a deputy program manager for both the State Coastal Conservancy and the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, and I'll be talking about their grant programs later on.
Thanks, Jessica. Becky?
Hi, I'm Becky Smythe. I'm the West Coast Regional Director for NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and I'll be talking about a small portion of the NOAA funding under the infrastructure law. And I believe my colleague Natalie, who I'll pass it off to, will be talking about another part.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Costantino Manning with NOAA Fisheries, the Restoration Center out of Santa Rosa. Yes, I'll be talking about some of the funds that'll be coming through our program that we'll be administering. We just have announced some of the awardees for our last notice of federal funding opportunity under 4 different opportunities that are coming through. And so I'll talk about that and what's coming up next.
Thanks, Natalie. And Sarah?
Yeah, hi, Sarah Haugen. Just be running the Zoom back here and the breakout room. So if you have any Zoom issues, you can chat and I'll see what I can do.
She's doing the important work for us. So just to really briefly go over today's agenda, we're going to start with presentations from all the speakers that just discussed themselves shortly. And then we're going to go into some breakout rooms where you'll be able to ask focused questions on each of the granting programs. And at the end, we'll all come back for a panel discussion that are kind of more general questions that we received beforehand before this forum. And also you can drop questions in the Q&A and we'll try to facilitate and bring some of those to our panelists as well. This is focused on trying to bring these federal funds into the San Francisco Bay Area region. So we have a regional focus. How can we really collaborate and capitalize on this moment to get more money here for restoration purposes? So just to remind everyone, that is the focus. Again, we'd love for you all to be chatting with each other and finding new connections. And so, yeah, we're going to get started first with Luisa from EPA. So take it away, Luisa.
Thanks, Nikki. Sarah's gonna, I don't see my slides yet, so I'm sure that the connectivity probably takes just a wee bit. So the first slide will be an introductory slide. It just has the name of our program, the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund. There we go. Which we have had as a program, a competitive grant program since 2008. You'll see our oft-repeated website address at the bottom of this slide, and will be at our last slide too. But copies of these slides will definitely be available if anyone wants to refer back to them. So next slide. This is just to give you a little bit of context. We have been around since 2008, actually, thanks to, in the beginning, this was Senator Feinstein's legacy of making sure that she could bring federal dollars to match the state and eventually local funding that the Restoration Authority reflects. But this was the first federal effort to bring funds to the region, the San Francisco Bay region, focused on water quality and habitat restoration. And then we got Bill. So in 2016, we did start a track to better communicate and support work being done in underserved communities. So this graphic shows you a little bit about that. But you'll see in FY22, which is the first of our Bill years, we started to get both a focus on underserved communities and climate resilience, but also a bump up of funds. And that is more due to the work of Jackie Spear. Next slide. So the first bump up was in 2022, and you see another huge increase in 2023. So these graphics show kind of the additive funds. Bill is a 5-year program across the board for the federal government. So we're in year 2 of Bill funds. And for us, the 24 million that was allocated under Bill is split evenly across the 5 Bill years. So 2022 to 2026. So that's the blue bar. And then the orange bar is our base funding, our water quality and habitat focused funding, which got a bump up last year and got another bump up this year. And we'll talk a little bit about the schedule for making those funds available. Next slide. So with the bill funding came also with the Biden administration, the executive order to really meet environmental justice needs. So we are running the 2 different funding pots as separate requests for applications. So the first RFA for the bill funds went out last year in FY22, and we just released the next round of FY23 bill funds. And we were able to expand our base program to kind of meet these environmental justice executive order expectations about reaching and supporting underserved communities. It is still a Clean Water Act program, so our funding is still focused on communities' relationship with water, the water that surrounds them, whether that be a bay or a watershed, but does allow us to expand the program to activities that we weren't able to fund under our base program. In our RFA, we have a map. This is on this slide, last year's map. In FY22, this year's map in the RFA will look a little bit different. We have added communities, and we are very open to hearing from communities if they are not reflected on the map. We're working with different indicators for underserved communities and adding more places on the map. So you'll see in this year's RFA that the blobs essentially have gone from orange to purple and expand in different regions of our 9 Bay Area county. Next slide. This is probably where I'll spend the most time just to identify the key differences between having 2 RFAs for San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund. The bill, the first column that focuses on the bill funding, is at approximately $5 million between FY22 and FY26. Our funding range is wide, but lower than our base. So 200K to $1 million is kind of what we expect to see proposals come in at. We were able to waive match. Our base program requires a very hefty 1-to-1 50% match. For our bill funds, that match has been waived by our regional administrator, essentially. So that is something that we have secured for all 5 years, and we're very glad about that. And again, the types of projects can really focus a little bit more on supporting community priorities. Our base funding, the RFA for the approximately 30 million of what is remaining in that allocation for FY23 will go out towards the end of May. We're still working on releasing that. The bill funding went out April 17th, so that RFA is actually open now. And then the base RFA will go out towards the end of May and have a due date sometime in the summer, probably July or August. That funding range is for more. Our base funding is focused on implementation projects. So 1 million to 3 million is our funding range for that, and still requires the 1-to-1 match. Next slide. We will be having our own very focused webinar. This is like I'm trying to talk fast, trying to get key information out in 10 minutes and move on to the next program. But we will be hosting our own bill-focused RFA webinar on May 18th from 2 to 3. If you're not on the mailing list or haven't visited our website to see that announcement, please let me know, email me. We will make sure to get that information to you. Free to register, obviously. Webinar, we'll be using Microsoft Teams as our platform. And then we will be also showing on our website additional support that we plan and did last year too, to give applicants while they're actually in the application development. We can't actually help craft your proposal, but we can certainly help demystify the black box that is applying for federal funds, a lot of forms, a lot of processes. We understand that. So our drop-in Q&As are to add additional support from my team, the EPA staff team, for those who are we hope will apply to our grant program. And then we also this year finalized a fact sheet, which I could also share electronically if folks haven't already seen it, and is also available on our website. Next slide. Look forward to the breakout sessions where I could answer more questions. And that's my email. Thanks, Nikki.
Great, thank you, Louisa. So yeah, just a reminder to hold your questions for the breakout rooms and the panel at the end of this forum. So next, we're going to move on to our NOAA presentations from Natalie and Becky. So if you all want to take it away.
Waiting for Sarah to call up our slides. But the first one, like Louisa's, is just an intro slide, which Natalie and I will be talking with you about some of the NOAA funding under the infrastructure laws. So next slide. Just to give some context, NOAA received about $3 billion across 18 very complicated, what they call provisions. Natalie and I are going to cover the 5 highlighted, and that's about 1.5 billion of the total 3. So this is a large part of what we received was going out the door. I would encourage you, if you're interested in any of the other topics, there is a website that's listed on the bottom for NOAA, all of the pieces, and you can also reach out to me or Natalie to see if we can put you in touch with someone who can give you more information. Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about NOAA's Office for Coastal Management, and the 3 funding programs we have. 2 are very related, and we do all of this in partnership. We do it with partnership with coastal management programs around the country, the National Estuarine Research Reserves, and in the case of the National Coastal Resilience Fund, we partner with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, which I'm sure you all are pretty aware of and maybe even partner with. We are aimed at ecosystems, communities, and economies. Next slide yet, please. This is just to point out that at the end of the day, we want communities resilient. We do have habitat drivers, but our focus, my part of NOAA, is around resilient communities. And through the Coastal Management Act, we have 50 years of experience with these types of partnerships. Next slide. So these are the 3 programs. I'm going to give you a brief overview today. It totals almost 800,000. And I will say that we were asked if we could talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. We can't talk about that yet, though some of the funding we're receiving in the Inflation Reduction Act will add money to these programs and the awards we make under that. We are hoping to provide more information in June around the Inflation Reduction Act, and I'm pretty sure Natalie and I will make sure that any of the announcements and information come to this group. So next slide, please. So for the coastal management programs, there's 207 million available across 5 years. And that equals about $40 million a year. We're looking for projects between, thank you for the acronyms, Nikki. We're looking for projects between 200,000 up to 6 million. It's primarily focused on habitat restoration planning, and engineering design. And obviously the planning ones would be the ones closer to 200,000, and the restoration would go, and habitat conservation would be closer to the 6 million. I will note within NOAA, to my knowledge, we're the only program that has acquisition money. With that, it has to be held in a public agency. It can't be held by a land trust or a nonprofit. For this, you have to partner and apply through the coastal management programs, our partners. So for you all, that's the Coastal Conservancy primarily. The other two agencies in the state are the Bay Conservation and Development Commission and the Coastal Commission. Together, they make up the California Coastal Management Program. And I know Jessica and Amy are on the phone and might be able to answer more questions about the approach they're taking this year to choose which projects across the state that they're thinking of applying. Because yes, this is nationwide and each state can apply for up to 3 a year. Next slide. Similar to the way we award the last one, we award this one to in partnership with the National Estuarine Research Reserve System. Similar eligible uses, restoration, planning, engineering, design, and acquisition. It's a smaller pot. It's $15 million a year, but it's limited to the 30 National Estuarine Research Reserves around the country. One of them is the San Francisco Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. And I saw also that Stuart Siegel, the interim manager, is on the phone. So again, we can put you in touch with him, or you can reach out to him about potential projects within or affecting the reserve boundary. Next slide, please. The biggest pot of money for that our part of NOAA works on is the National Coastal Resilience Fund. It's $140 million a year in partnership with the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I will note that we have an ongoing approximately $35 million a year program to support the National Coastal Resilience Fund. The bipartisan infrastructure law money added another $100 million for the next 5 years, or next 4 years now. The program priorities are nature-based solutions, community resilience, fish and wildlife, and the eligible entities are really broad. And it could go anywhere from capacity building to restoration implementation. Femke Freiberg is your local point of contact, and happy to put you in touch with her, but I can also answer a number of questions on that. They also emphasize community engagement in this work and this funding, and we also emphasize innovation and sustainability. Next slide, please. Thank you, Nikki. I would note that we just on April 21st announced a large part of this funding. So there were $54 million awarded with Inflation Reduction Act for the coastal management programs and 23 for the reserves. The National Coastal Resilience Fund was awarded in November. The first two programs, the Coastal Management Program and the Estuarine Research Reserves, year 2 funding will be announced hopefully in the next couple of weeks, the funding opportunity for it, fingers crossed. And the last one, the letters of intent just closed. But that is a yearly program, so I would definitely keep your eye out for that. And just as an example, next slide, please. One of the projects we awarded under the National Coastal Resilience Fund was advancing living shoreline planning. And this is a grant to our friends at the Conservancy around designing living shorelines. And the hope is that once these are designed, the partners can come back and apply for implementation funding. So that's what we're really hoping with this program. Everything from capacity building and continue to come back and apply until you actually implement the program. I'm going to pass it off to Natalie for her to talk about the other funding opportunities.
Great, thank you, Becky. And yeah, a lot of similarities within our programs. But I'm with Fisheries, and so out of the Office of Habitat Conservation, and we've been working on habitat restoration and conservation for over 30 years through, we had 2 programs. We have the community-based restoration program and damage assessment remediation restoration program. So that's dealing with oil spill and contaminant releases. So I've been managing both of those programs and working on habitat restoration for some time. And we have I think many of you on this call may have worked with us in the past, both under our oil spill and our community-based programs. But we have great partners, and we're super excited about what we've just been able to fund through BIL and some portion of IRA. And we're looking forward to this next round, which, as Becky mentioned, hopefully we'll get notification in June for that. Next slide. But actually, this is not our first rodeo. We also had administered under Obama the American Recovery Reinvestment Act. And so many of you have worked with us on that. We funded almost $19 million in San Francisco Bay, both in the North and South Bay, for habitat restoration. In this most recent round, we have several different habitat restoration and fish passage opportunities. We had $891 million for over 5 years for habitat restoration and resilience. We're also looking at resilience in not only in the coastal ecosystems, but also with our coastal communities. And so we had a real big emphasis also on underserved communities and tribal. So we also had some tribal fish passage that was announced and also funded. So we do focus, however, on NOAA's trust resources, so our fisheries and threatened and endangered species that mostly reside underwater. And so that's always, we're looking with our Notice of Federal Funder Opportunity, which you'll hear quite a bit, our NOFOs. There are a description of where the criteria lie for these types of restoration projects and the different species that we are hoping to address, as well as the coastal communities. Next slide. So our last round, which will be very similar to this next round, we had 4 competitions under the Notice of Federal Funding Opportunity. So we had fish passage, we had tribal fish passage, transformational habitat restoration, which was kind of our larger ask, and habitat restoration for underserved communities. This past year, our funding was tenfold for BIL from our regular community-based restoration program. So we had a lot of interest. Next slide. One of the main aspects, both under the transformational as well as the underserved community projects, as we do want to have an emphasis or an association with underserved communities. When we did put out our new announcement, we actually garnered 90% more new partners to NOAA Fisheries. So being able to address those communities has also increased our partnerships with a lot of new folks. We didn't ask for any proof, but we had asked applicants to self-identify. And for underserved community projects, there's a variety of different categories, from on-the-ground restoration to training programs, internal breaking down barriers for careers in restoration, facilitating community participation in visioning efforts, and creating plans for future large-scale habitat restoration projects. So, you know, design, engineering, and working with other firms and whatnot. Next slide. So as Becky mentioned, we also just had an announcement put out for all of our awards nationwide. Once again, we are a nationwide program, so this is a competitive program, an opportunity across our coastal United States. And we had 109 awards for over $480 million. And the range in projects for fish passage range from 1.2 million to 15 million. For tribal, 400,000 to 3.6 million, transformational, 500,000 to 14.9 million, and underserved for 200,000 up to $1 million in projects. So as you can see, this map is full of beautifully colored dots, ranging in all of those different categories. Next slide. So here's kind of a graphic that shows the different types of awardees across the different types of awards that we wanted to present. Majority of, well, about 50% were nonprofits, but we did have state and local governments, county governments, and also you can see the tribal, the various different tribes. Some are federally recognized as, and others are state. But this is a good example of who's been applying for these BIL funds. Next slide. And these are the types of habitat restoration projects that were funded. We had some native oyster reef projects. Multiple projects means that there was a diversity of project types, probably like riparian to wetland. We had living shorelines, hydrologic restoration, which mostly means some, wetland, opening up wetlands, opening up tributaries. So everything from estuaries to up into the watershed. Fish passage, of course, because we had a fish passage specific NOFO, coral restoration, and then capacity building, which is kind of built into all of these types of restoration projects. Next slide. So the listed species, once again, we do put some highlight when you do apply on grants.gov for these specific different project types. We do ask, are there listed species, or what we call the species in the spotlight? These are NOAA trust species. Of the 55% of the awards did list benefits to species. So they received over $300 million in funding. And 24 awards, 126 million provided benefits to 4 of our species in the spotlight. So that's Atlantic salmon, coho, southern right whale, and white abalone. And then 2 of these, the beluga whales and Hawaiian monk seals, had some indirect benefits to those species. Next slide. So in California, this is just a cursory list of what we were able to fund, or at least this is what we're suggesting for funding. So a variety of different projects, from floodplain restoration to restoring kelp habitat off of our Sonoma coast. And we do have some tribal restoration projects, so specific tribal groups, and salmon fish passage restoration. Next slide. So what's next? So this is for both Becky and I. Within our programs, we do continue to provide technical assistance to our partners. So throughout the phase of once they receive the grant, we will work with them through the whole life of the grant to make sure that the technical assistance is there, that there's continued participation with our NOAA folks. We have also gathered lessons learned from the last round of Notice of Federal Funding Opportunity. So we're implementing some of those lessons learned into this next round of funding. Some of the things that came out was a little bit of a longer application period. So we're looking, depending on the different type of Notice of Federal Funding Opportunity, anything from 45 days to 120 days. We were also asked if we could stagger the release of some of those funding opportunity notices so that folks could not only do transformational, but potentially do underserved. So that's, there was a recommendation that came in. And yes, the announcements will be coming out in late May, and for at least for Office of Habitat Conservation, probably late June for those, and we'll get those notifications out as soon as they come out. But keep attentive to grants.gov, and also keep looking back at our NOAA website, the one that Becky Smythe had initially offered in her second or third slide. Becky, do you want to add anything to this particular?
Just that we had a question about match. NOAA funding under this does not require match. It's magic money.
Yeah. So with that, there is under the criteria, so we do score based on criteria. If there is match, you do get some points, but match is not required. And I think that's it. Let me see, is there one more slide? Yeah, and that's our contact information there for anybody who's interested.
Great. Thank you both, Natalie and Becky. A reminder to, if you're interested in learning more about this, you can join Natalie and Becky or Louisa in the breakout rooms shortly after. So we have one more presentation from Jessica Davenport about the State Coastal Conservancy and the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. So I think Sarah will pull up those slides. And after that presentation, you'll be able to choose a breakout room to join to ask specific questions. So go ahead, Jessica.
Thank you, Nikki. Well, it's great to see so many people on this forum. And I'm going to be talking about two different agencies, but with very similar funding opportunities, the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority and the State Coastal Conservancy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start with the San Francisco Bay. So basically, just to give you an overview, I'll be talking about mostly the Coastal Conservancy's Climate Resilience Grant Program, although I'm going to mention a couple other community-focused grant programs. The Restoration Authority's Competitive Grant Round and the Authority's Community Grants Program. Next slide, please. So starting with the Restoration Authority, as many of you know, it's a regional agency created to fund shoreline projects that will protect, restore, and enhance San Francisco Bay. The money comes from Measure AA, passed by about 70% of the voters in 2016. It's a parcel tax that generates about $25 million a year for 20 years. And we're currently about to enter our 7th year of grant rounds. The jurisdiction is focused on the shoreline of the 9 Bay Area counties. It does exclude the Delta primary zone. Next slide, please. And the Restoration Authority Act puts some boundaries on what we can fund. We can fund habitat projects along the shoreline, and it can be tidal wetlands and other natural habitats, and it can go a bit into the bay and a bit upland, but basically along the shoreline. And we can also fund flood management features and public access features that are part of a habitat project. So like Bay Trail, if it's part of a restoration project, or a levee that's part of a restoration project. Next slide. We, like some of the other programs mentioned, have a very wide range of eligible grantees, basically all different kinds of government agencies, tribal governments, nonprofits, and even owners or operators of shoreline parcels. The eligible locations are the 9 counties listed here, and the shoreline is the whole bay, and going up into the secondary zone of the Delta, so northern Contra Costa County shoreline and Solano, but not going all the way into the Delta primary zone. Next slide. There's 4 areas that Measure AA projects need to address, at least one of. One is clean water and pollution prevention. And this can be addressed through actually restoring a wetland, since they do filter pollution, but there can also be components related to shoreline cleanups and restoring creeks where they flow into the bay. Next slide. A really important area, of course, is our emphasis on enhancing public lands for expanded and improved habitat for fish, birds, and mammals. Also, protecting and restoring wetlands that might not even be wetlands right now. We can fund acquisition of an area that could be restored to wetland, and then we can actually fund the restoration. And then once it's restored, we can provide funding for stewardship, maintenance, and monitoring of these habitat restoration projects to make sure they have ongoing benefits to people and wildlife. Next slide. So Measure AA can fund natural flood protection, which is the wetlands themselves and their ability to reduce wave energy and protect against flooding that way. But also our funding can build and improve levees that are a necessary part of a wetland restoration project. Next slide. And then finally, shoreline public access is very important for giving people access to the shoreline. Our funds can support constructing new or repairing existing trails, signs, benches, bathrooms, all those kind of important things that enable people to use the shoreline. And also support interpretive materials and events that encourage community engagement in our shoreline resources. Next slide. So in addition to those eligibility criteria, Measure AA has prioritization criteria, and they are explained in more detail in our request for proposal, which will be coming out in July, although we have a couple of years ago version on our website now. But basically, we're looking for projects that will have a great positive impact on the Bay in all the different ways that were just described. And we're also looking for projects that have a long-term impact. And usually that's referring to projects that are can adapt to sea level rise. But there could be other long-term impacts like investing in youth in their engagement in workforce development, so that they will have a long-term impact on our Bay by continuing their work to protect and restore resources. Geographic distribution, I'll be talking about that in a later slide. Leveraging state and federal funds and public-private partnerships is another criterion. However, we do not have a match requirement, so that can be helpful. And we are prioritizing projects that benefit economically disadvantaged communities. And we have a map that is going to be updated soon that will show that. Our existing maps were based on the 2010 census, and it's been a while, so those will be updated. We're looking for projects that benefit the region's economy by creating jobs, engaging youth and young adults, incorporating monitoring and stewardship, and then meeting the criteria of these other agencies, the Conservancy, BCDC, and the San Francisco Bay Joint Venture. Next slide. Another thing that we look for in applications is the project's likelihood of success. And this is based on the applicant's capacity to complete and maintain the project, or if it's something that they're new at, that they have a strong partnership with an experienced group or firm, and also the project's level of community involvement and benefits, or an innovative partnership. Next slide. So innovative partnerships, we just wanted to expand the types of groups that get engaged in these projects. So in addition to community-based nonprofits, we are supportive of projects that have partnerships with healthcare providers, faith-based organizations, civic organizations, arts organizations, businesses, etc. And then as far as benefiting the community, we're looking for projects that will directly engage community groups and have relevant messaging to reach them. Also, projects that will alleviate stressors within communities, like providing recreational amenities in areas where there aren't a lot of green spaces, and reducing pollution burden, and providing leadership development opportunities. So one of the things that we've done to support our prospective grantees is the Conservancy's developed tips for meaningful community engagement, and those are available on our website. Next slide. So basically, any project phase is eligible from acquisition all the way through design, construction, and monitoring. Next slide. And just a couple examples of projects that the authority has funded that then leveraged a lot of federal funding. You heard already about regionally advancing living shorelines, which leveraged NOAA funding, but we also have a couple of projects that have leveraged the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers funding. So the South Bay Shoreline Project is received the largest grant from the Restoration Authority at 61 million, and it was able to leverage 75 million of Army Corps funding. The North Richmond Living Levee project is about a $700,000 grant to West County Wastewater Agency or District. And we learned that has leveraged 45 million in the latest Water Resources Development Act from last year. So that was very exciting. And both of these projects include habitat restoration, flood protection, public access, and benefits to economically disadvantaged communities. So not every project has to do everything, but these are two examples that do quite a lot. Next slide. So in our regular grant round process, as mentioned, we expect, as long as our board approves it, to release an RFP in July this year. And so we'll be inviting pre-applications so that you can have a consultation with staff and get feedback, and then submit a full application in early October. We'll be setting those exact dates soon. And then the staff and advisory committee members will review applications. And then based on that discussion, we will recommend a preliminary list of projects that will be brought to the board for funding, and then eventually bring the full-fledged staff recommendations to the board as the projects are ready. Next slide. So for this upcoming grant round, as I mentioned, we do strongly encourage consultation. We have found that our applications are getting better and better every year, partly because of the consultations, and also for those who did not receive funding in any given year, we provide all the feedback from our reviewers, and they often lead to stronger applications the following year and can get funded, even if they weren't funded the first time. So just something to keep in mind. We have roughly 22 million available this year because of some previous commitments, but this is a bump back up from the last few years where we were down more in the $11 million range because of the large grant to the South Bay Shoreline project, which has now gotten all of that money. Next slide. So just some tips. Make sure to really carefully look at the eligibility criteria and the prioritization criteria, as well as how to explain your project's likelihood of success, and make sure that your application packet is complete with all these elements. And there's a lot more information on our grants webpage. Next slide. So just jumping into the next program, our community grants program. This is specifically designed to fund projects led by community-based organizations in economically disadvantaged communities. And the projects could involve community visioning, training and education, relationship building with shoreline landowners, and implementation of shoreline habitat projects. Next slide. So currently this is a rolling process, and we have applications available on the website. You can submit them at any time. Funding is now up to $200,000 per project. And we have a specific community grants page with more detailed guidance on that. Next slide. And so within our, it's the same funding source. So we have the same prioritization criteria, but within that, we put emphasis on the criteria around benefiting economically disadvantaged communities and engaging youth and young adults. Next slide. And then we also are specifically looking at projects that have community benefits that will be achieved in the near future. And there's a well-defined community engagement process, and also that there's a sense of urgency. This is a pressing need. Next slide. So similar tips, just to make sure you review those eligibility and prioritization criteria really well. And then the application is a lot simpler for the community grants. It's just a couple pages with a basic schedule and budget, some project maps and photos, and then the support letters are optional. We do end up needing a lot more information, but the way we handle that is to, if a project is selected, a staff person is assigned to work with that grantee to collect all the needed information to bring a staff recommendation to our board. Next slide. And so an example of one of these community grants is the Candlestick Point Stewardship Project. It was a $100,000 grant to Literacy for Environmental Justice to do work at the Candlestick Point State Recreation Area in the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood. And they planted 6,500 native plants, cleaned up trash, provided paid job training to 12 eco-apprentices, and they engaged more than 300 community members in stewardship. So work days, other fun stuff on the shoreline. And so jumping along to the State Coastal Conservancy, the climate resilience funding is going to be awarded and has already started to be awarded in guided by our new strategic plan, which some of you probably gave input on. It's focusing on 5 goals: prioritizing equity, enjoying the coast, protecting and restoring the coast, being climate ready. And then we have organizational goals. Next slide. So within that goal 1 of prioritize equity, we're focusing on the areas of returning power to tribes, supporting meaningful engagement by systemically excluded communities, and incorporating workforce development into our projects. Next slide. And I just wanted to also mention the Conservancy's community-oriented grant programs, the Explore the Coast program that funds projects that provide coastal experiences for people who face challenges accessing and enjoying the coast. And then the Coastal Stories program that funds projects that will develop storytelling materials that represent voices that have been historically excluded. And so it fosters a sense of welcomeness along the coast. Next slide. So how to apply for the climate resilience funding, which includes bay restoration, nature-based sea level rise adaptation. You start by sending an email to Moira McInnesby, our regional manager. And at that point, we may or may not need a phone or Zoom call to clarify the project idea. And then it goes one of 4 paths. Either you will hear that your project is not a good fit, or you'll be asked to send a pre-proposal. If it's something that we're feeling like pretty clear that it could be a really good fit, we would ask you to send a full proposal right away. And then if it's an existing project that just needs more funding, you can send an updated scope or budget. So, but we'll let you know that after you send the email. So we do accept inquiries and proposals on a rolling basis, and we'll get back to you within 60 days, but usually quite a bit faster than that. And the Conservancy has 5 board meetings per year, but you do need to plan for a few months lead time for us to prepare our staff recs 2 months in advance. And prior to that, we need to review CEQA documents and deal with other questions that come up. Next slide. And so some examples, as I mentioned, in some ways our funding is similar between the Coastal Conservancy and Restoration Authority. And the Coastal Conservancy's Bay Area program has a much larger jurisdiction, goes throughout all 9 Bay Area counties, whereas Restoration Authority is just along the shoreline. But within that overlapping shoreline area, we do support, we can support the same projects sometimes. So for example, with Heron's Head Park Shoreline Resilience Project, that's a grant to the Port of San Francisco. The Restoration Authority initially funded that project to get started with some growing native plants. And then it ended up getting funded by a few different funders, including a U.S. Fish and Wildlife grant through the Coastal Conservancy for the construction of a gravel beach that was protecting an eroding marsh. And then there's now about to be a second grant to the port for 10 years of monitoring through the Restoration Authority. And then similarly with Lower Walnut Creek, the Restoration Authority provided funding. They had multiple funders, and one of them was the Coastal Conservancy with a NICWIC, National Coastal Wetlands Conservation Grant. Next slide. So thank you, and look forward to hearing your questions in our breakout rooms.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. We are making excellent time. So I'm going to pass it to Sarah to describe the process of what's going to happen now at the breakout rooms.
Yes, hi everyone. So we have a few pre-organized breakout rooms for NOAA, EPA, or SFBRA SCC. So when I open them, you'll have the opportunity to join anyone you want. We will have time for you to be in each one for 15 minutes, but you can also just stay in one if you want to hear all about what they're doing with that agency. So I'll just send out a little broadcast message when you're getting close to 15 minutes if you want to change rooms. So that's how it's going to work. I will open them up now. Let me just make sure I have the correct setup here for, okay. Great, I'm gonna open all the rooms. If you have any trouble getting into them, you can let me know. For those still here, looks like there's some space in the EPA room. They all have space technically, but. Rebecca, you should be able to click a button that says join breakout. If you're having trouble though, I can assign you to a room. For those still in here, let me know if you need help getting into a room. I can assign you if you're having trouble. For those still in here, you can join a breakout room with one of the agencies. And if you need help, let me know. Otherwise, you can just hang out until we get started with the panel. I'm going to pause the recording now.
Thank you all again to our speakers. We're going to welcome back Louisa, Natalie, Jessica, and Becky to be on a panel discussion now that I will be facilitating based on pre-submitted questions that were sent in prior to this funding forum. If you have any remaining questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A. We'll be trying to answer those as well in live time. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. We have about 15 minutes for these questions. One of the first questions was, are these grants only for capital projects, or can you also fund planning, community outreach, design, and scientific studies related to wetland restoration?
I'm going to say yes for the NOAA fisheries funds.
I will say yes as well, with the caveat that because we have 2 different requests for applications and 2 different emphases in those 2, that the bill funding is better suited for just planning, whereas our base funding are larger dollar amount and larger implementation project focused, that we can fund planning, but really it only scores well and so competes well when it's linked to implementation.
And I would add, yes, another yes. And for the National Coastal Resilience Fund in particular, there's a real emphasis throughout on the community engagement piece. So if you're looking for those funding to really engage with and support community involvement in the capacity building and throughout the project, there's some really interesting criteria around what that looks like, and it's really encouraged in that funding. In particular, I thought, and I need to look at EPA because I know you've been doing a lot of work, I thought the language that NIFWF, National Fish and Wildlife staff, came up with was really strong on that particular aspect.
And for the Conservancy and Restoration Authority, we definitely fund planning, community outreach, design. I would say not so much the scientific studies. We generally point people to some other funders. I mean, it depends. Like South Bay Salt Ponds Restoration Project has a lot of scientific studies embedded in the restoration for the adaptive management. So that's a case where we do fund it, but not like a standalone scientific study. And I feel like NOAA might have some other pots, maybe not represented by you two, that's more for scientific studies.
Yeah, the National Centers for Coastal Ocean Science have been doing some scientific studies, especially around sea level rise, and have had funding under their ecological effects of sea level rise programs over the years.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's some other state ones that, but they're not coming to mind at the moment. But I would say we wouldn't be your first place to look for scientific studies, but definitely for planning and design. We often are called out as like, you can get your planning money from them, and then lots of other people will help you with the construction money. So yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. The next question, we just had this in the NOAA session, was if you could share advice for any small nonprofit or community-based organizations wishing to access this funding. Is it better to partner with others in applications? And maybe y'all can speak to if there's a specific funding source out of the ones discussed today that you think would be best for smaller organizations to go for as well.
Well, I could start this time. So our community grants program with the Restoration Authority is specifically for community-based organizations located in economically disadvantaged communities. If you're a small nonprofit, but you're not a community-based org, or you're not in an EDC, then it might be good to partner with someone else. The Conservancy does fund quite a few small nonprofits. I mentioned the Explore the Coast and the Coastal Stories programs. Those are many small grants to a lot of small nonprofits. But it really just depends on the project. I do think sometimes small nonprofits find it less burdensome to partner with, say, a city or a county or a water district or somebody who has the infrastructure to handle the administrative side of a grant. And then they get to do the more fun part of actually like engaging the community and doing the work on the ground. So it just depends what you're up for as the staff of that small nonprofit as well.
I would completely agree with that advice, especially receiving federal funds. It's really up to the organization and what they're up for, because it requires a lot of administrative capacity to receive federal funds. As I mentioned before, we require a lot of forms. We require a lot of registration. You'll get to know if you want to receive federal funds what a UEI number is, which you register in sam.gov. Like all those things have to happen for you to actually receive our funds, and we acknowledge that they become a death by 1,000 cuts, like so many steps, administrative steps, that it's off-putting and perhaps a barrier to entry. And yet that is unfortunately the way that receiving federal funds is set up. So as Jessica mentioned, you can sidestep that by having another entity do that administrative burden, and then just focus on the work. I'd say the way to frame it is you're building your own administrative capacity if you are willing to take on the work, and thus can be an entity that can serve other, even smaller community-based organizations, or those that don't want to do that. So we encourage, it can be done. It does require a lot of patience and a lot of help, and we are here to help you. But it is a decision that an organization should make based on their own abilities.
Okay, I think that Noah would probably echo that sentiment. We're going to move on to another question. So for the purposes of all these funding sources, does wetlands restoration include watersheds?
Yes.
Maybe not the top of the Mississippi watershed, but yes.
For the Conservancy, yes. For the Restoration Authority, no. Just the part of the creek below head of tide, plus a little bit more migration space for sea level rise.
For NOAA fisheries, yes.
Okay, great. Is this Jessica, did you want to say something? Okay, sorry. Is the scope and size of a project a factor when determining which project to fund? In other words, does a project that is 1 acre, 5 acres, 10 acres have the same chance of being funded as a project that is 100 acres or more?
Yes, it has the same chance.
Yeah, I think for this one, part of it is about what is the outcome. For say one that's working at coastal resilience, does that wetland restoration help reduce flooding to an urban community that will bring benefit to 600 people? Then absolutely that 1 acre is beneficial. And so tying what you're trying to do with the outcome you're trying to achieve and why you're doing it at that size, I think is, from my perspective, one of the things to think about in what you're applying for and why, as far as size and scope.
And I would say for the Restoration Authority, we kind of take a portfolio approach to funding projects. We definitely have goals that were set out when this measure was taken to the voters around restoring 15,000 acres of tidal wetlands and other habitats along the shoreline. So we need to factor size in for at least some of our projects, but we also have all these other factors that we're trying to address. So a small project that can really address some needs of an economically disadvantaged community would also be very competitive. So it's a range, and it's similar to what Becky said.
For NOAA fishing, it really depends. Like what Becky said, I ditto her answer. But because we have like 4 different funding opportunities, like the transformational, we are looking at something that's transformational, something that is really going to make a big difference. And sometimes those are big projects. But like, for instance, for tribal fisheries, or even our fish passage, even, one small dam removal or impediment in the stream makes a significant difference to the communities as well as the fishery. So, that's a significant improvement. So it really kind of depends on which, opportunity you're looking at.
Great. The next question is, how can this funding be used for invasive plant control? Or I guess, is that even allowed in these granting programs?
Yeah, it can be. Right now, both the Conservancy and the Restoration Authority fund the invasive Spartina project, for example, that's addressing invasive Spartina all over the bay. Well, luckily, it's been reduced so much that they're not actually all over the bay, but that's their project scope. And then we also have other projects that include weed management. It's usually integrated with some kind of habitat restoration at the same time. So, and it's really important that it, uses an integrated pest management approach and a prioritization approach. We want to make sure, knowing that weeds will always be with us. We want to fund efforts that have like clear goals of why are we doing this and what's expected to be achieved in a sustainable way and things like that. So it definitely has to meet certain bar, but it can be a component of a project.
In our case, exactly what Jessica just said, it can be a component of something that is restoration focused, habitat restoration focused. It probably would not compete well if for some reason it was something very siloed and away from integrated approach.
Yeah, and I would have to agree with both of that, as well as if you're looking at the NOAA funding, remember you're competing nationwide, and so you will be going up against other restoration projects that may have a diversity of projects within them. So yeah, I would add that to a variety of different components for habitat restoration, not just the removal of invasive species.
Okay, great. I think we have time for about one more question. So one of the questions was, how much overhead or indirect costs are allowed in project budgets, and what is agency oversight like for active projects?
I can answer that one quickly for us. 20% indirect is allowed. It has to be justified. And as far as oversight, the way that our projects work is that we have grant agreements, and then there's periodic invoicing, whether monthly or quarterly, and accompanied with progress reports. That's the main form of oversight. And there is an opportunity for small groups that cannot float the cost to have their funding advanced, but they still have to account for everything.
I was hoping that Natalie or Becky was gonna do the federal government indirect cost rate answer.
Yeah.
I
can do it, Louisa, if you want.
I'd love that. Go ahead.
Most organizations, getting back to Louisa's point about the bureaucracy and all the systems and things you have to know in order to apply, primarily it's dependent on your federal negotiated indirect cost rate that is pre-negotiated. There are some funding opportunities like the National Coastal Resilience Fund, or Natalie, I don't know if you were able to, for some of your underserved, that allows some flexibility that sets a maximum different or a minimum different than that But the default is, do you have a federally negotiated indirect cost rate? And that's where it starts. Louise says, that bureaucratic answer enough for
No, that's yes. In your grant agreement, that becomes part of negotiating your budget if you do want to claim indirect costs, and there is a de minimis if you don't want to go through the process of getting a negotiated federal indirect cost rate. There is a de minimis amount, which I think is 10% of your total grant award. So there's that option. And I think in general, as Jessica was saying, we don't have the option for advance. All of our grant agreements are set up as reimbursable. So you can get reimbursed based on work as frequently as you wish, every 2 weeks, every month, every quarter, and that works, but it's not an advanced system. And we do require quarterly reports as well.
Okay, great. Thank you all. I just want to give a major thanks to our panelists today. Thank you everyone for being here, sharing your knowledge. Again, this is an amazing opportunity with a ton of funding coming in. And so on that note, I would like to remark that the San Francisco Bay Joint Venture does host a regional funding work group. We meet on the second Thursdays of every month. So the next meeting will be next Thursday, May 11th from 3 to 4 p.m. And the reasoning for this funding work group, again, is to track these funds that we talked about today and other federal and state funds for restoration, climate adaptation, resilience planning, environmental justice, and equity work, so that we can really bring people into a space to collaborate. So some of these smaller organizations to find partners that can administer these federal grants, for instance, and really do some grant matchmaking, some proposal brainstorming. We also do skill shares and bring in speakers from different agencies. So if you would like to be a part of that funding working group, you can reach out to me directly. I manage it and can add you. I will drop my email in the chat, but we will also be sending out follow-up information with all these granting opportunities, all the resources for them, all of our contact information. So again, feel free to reach out to any of us if you have specific questions that weren't answered today. And I think we're going to create an FAQ as well. I plug again for the EPA funding webinar on May 18th. Louisa, I think you said that was available online to sign up. We'll include a link to that. And the San Francisco Bay Joint Venture also sends out periodic Bay blasts and newsletters with quick information about these types of upcoming events and webinars. So we can also add you and subscribe you to that newsletter if you'd like to receive that. So again, a huge thank you to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Sarah, for managing all the technology behind the scenes here. And thank you to all our panelists. I hope that this is helpful. I hope that you all get some money. And yeah, let's do it for the Bay. Have a great rainy afternoon, and we'll see everyone another time.